Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Once again, we are comparing two of the biggest brands in the world of network attached storage. We are looking at Synology versus QNAP, and we're looking at two of their 4-bay solutions for their prosumer and SMB users in the desktop lineup. However, there's one big old elephant in the room that we got to discuss, and that is quite simply the time between the release of these two devices. There has been more than 2 years, I think about 2 years and 2 months at the time of recording, difference between the release of these two devices. The newer release between them is the QNAP TS-453E. It is a new 4-bay from them, released right at the end of August 2022, and we are comparing it against this, still a very, very, very popular Synology NAS. This is the Synology DS920, which was released, depending on where you are in the world, summer 2020. So an enormous amount of difference between them. However, once again, at the time of recording, you're going to keep hearing that a lot in this video, by the way, the 920 has yet to see a refresh from Synology formally. It is still the prosumer 4-bay in their lineup, and a lot of you that are buying your first or maybe upgrading an older existing network attached storage device from your home or business network have come to these two brands and then gone, right, well, that's the new QNAP, what about, oh, it's still the 920. So that's what this video is about. It's helping you decide which one's best for you, because there are reasons to go for either of these, not just the old one, although I'll be straight with you, that is a big old shock between these two devices, but there's still other reasons why you should think about which one of these is best suited for your needs. Before we go any further though, let's say what they've got in common, because regardless of which one of these two you go for, I'm pleased to say that you will have certain things guaranteed. First and foremost, they've both got 3 years of manufacturer's warranty. They're both hardware and software combined solutions with licenses for lots of their software through and through. They're both great examples of what QTS and DSM from each respective brand can offer you in terms of file management, in terms of backups, virtualization, surveillance, multimedia, cloud support. Just a huge range of applications and services that we'll touch on more later on in the video are available to you immediately by buying these two solutions there. They also work with a myriad of third-party software and hardware platforms, ranging from software as a service such as Google and Microsoft applications, as well as operating systems ranging from Mac to Windows to Android to Linux as well, with applications available from everywhere on your app center of your mobile device to desktop tools and other sources as well. They both support both SATA SSDs and M2 NVMEs, but to a slightly different degree that we'll talk about later on, and both of which can run on just a single hard drive if you choose, but it is obviously recommended to use multiple of them in different RAID configurations that allow you to have both performance benefits and safety nets in the form of redundancy and parity available to you. So that is pretty much what you're getting with these systems. Compact, low noise, high production, high efficiency 24/7 solutions. However, let's start talking about those differences, right? The first big difference to talk about, again, is the old wallet money there. Between the two of these, because of the time difference since release and the fact that the 920 was released in summer 2020, the time this has been in the market in terms of availability, in terms of production, in terms of flexibility and pricing, and its age, results in the device knocking around currently for about 500 to 550 nicker, depending where you're shopping around the world. Also, it's been on offer several times during the likes of Black Friday and Prime Day over the last couple of years. Now, the TS-453E is not going to benefit from some of that. First and foremost, because it's brand new, it's a lot closer to the old RRP recommended retail price. Also, availability is lower, which always drives the price higher, and hardware shortages currently of newer components have resulted in its price point being noticeably different. And although at the time of recording it's not available in many retailers, I will say that where I have found it, it has retailed for about £690 right now. That is a tremendous difference between them. Now, yes, it's a more modern release, and we will talk about where that money translates into value in just a bit, but it has to be said that if what you are worrying about is your budget, this is not going to win in terms of budget. It may win in terms of value and what you get based on your usage, we'll get on in a bit. But if what you care about is hard-earned dinero, that's going to be the one for you there. But let's talk about that hardware. Let's talk about the internal hardware of these two solutions here. Because, again, the time difference between them really does play out quite significantly in terms of that hardware. Now, the DS920 arrives with an Intel Celeron processor. It is the J4125 processor there. It's a 2.0 GHz CPU that can be burst up to 2.7 GHz when needed over a 4-core processor. It also has embedded graphics on board that range at 250 MHz that can be, again, scaled up or clocked to 750 MHz for the embedded graphics when needed for things like 4K, for virtualization, and basically graphic-enabled processes there to have an onboard component within the CPU that handles those tasks a great deal better. On CPU benchmark, it rates for 2,981, so it's obviously gone down in its lifetime since it was first released, but the system arrives with 4 GB of DDR4 memory soldered to the board, and an additional slot that allows you to upgrade it with 4 GB of Synology's own DDR4 memory. The system also has 2 M2 NVMe slots there on the base that can be utilised for SSD caching. That ultimately means that in terms of read caching, more frequently accessed files are copied over to the SSD to allow faster access to them. And in terms of write caching, it allows you during the write process that data is written to the SSD and then move over to the hard drive array there, thereby assisting a lot of those upload performance speeds. So that's where your caching can benefit you there. So how does it compare 2 years later to the release of the 453E? Well, the Celeron-based processor, because it is another Intel Celeron, is markedly different, a much later release processor indeed. Whereas the mid-2019 CPU inside the 920 is still, kicking around and quite good. This is a 2021 processor, a Q3 2021, and it is the J6412, a 2.0 GHz CPU that can be burst up to 2.6 GHz. And again, that is another quad core, so 4-core, 4-thread on both of them. The onboard graphics starts at 350 MHz and can be scaled up to 800 MHz. Not a tremendous difference, but still enough in terms of video decoding as well as certain codecs. But overall, just a more efficient CPU, but also more powerful at the same time. That's both of the best boxes being ticked for you there indeed. CPU benchmark rate that CPU at 3,930. So again, nearly 1,000 points of difference on CPU benchmark in terms of scoring for that CPU. Now it arrives with 8 GB of DDR4 memory. Now this is both good and bad news. So already you're arriving with twice the memory by default of this system there. So again, you have to scale that into the price just a little bit there as well. However, much like the 4 GB by default on the Synology, that 8 GB is soldered. You can't upgrade it. Despite that CPU supporting up to a potential 32 GB of DDR4 memory, this memory soldered to the board means that 8 GB is all you're going to get. So it's great for day one at 8 GB, but a real shame you can't scale it up later on. It also has those M2 NVMe slots on board, great stuff. And again, these are PCIe Gen 3 x 2. And again, we don't know the generation of the M2s inside the 920. I assume they are Gen 2 because of the architecture of the system, maybe Gen 2 x 4. But still nonetheless, the M2 slots on the QNAP also support caching, but unlike the Synology, they have 2 other, or even indeed 3 other functions open to them. The first function is they can be utilised for something called QTIA, which combines the larger hard drive and SSD storage array, and there, as files are being accessed, more frequently accessed files aren't copied over to the SSDs, they are moved for easier access to them on the M2 NVMe portion of the storage pool. And again, this doesn't just apply to smaller files, it can apply to bigger files as well, which is very different to traditional caching. You can also use them for a standalone storage pool. You can have a storage pool made up of much faster M2 NVMEs which can be used for the running the system. They can be used for dedicated applications, be used for storage arrays and databases. They can be used for multimedia, VMs. It's up to you. The last thing you can use those M2s for on the QNAP is to take advantage of Google's M2 TPU upgrade card, the AI upgrade card, of which there are lots out there now that knock around for about 20 to 30 quid, which means this system will allow you to enhance its AI supported services, something I'll touch on later on. Ultimately, it means that in terms of the hardware you're getting inside, yes, this has a higher price point, but bear in mind that the class of the architecture inside is notably higher thanks to that 2 years of difference, which means I'm still inclined to think this is better value for money, even though the Synology DS920 is a better price point. And another thing to bear in mind between the two of them, something that will play out a lot more later on, is the Synology price point is a lot more provisioned between the hardware software. You've always found with the Synology that the price point you are paying is 60% for the software and 40% for the hardware. And in terms of QNAP, that balance is either completely the other way around or more 50-50. And again, this will make more sense later on. Next up, let's talk about the design of these two NASs, because they're quite distinct in how they look. They look quite similar, casually at a glance. They've both got 4 bays on the front. They're both utilising plastic chassis that are kind of that nice brushed effect there between the two of them. But between them, it's clear that the QNAP is a little smaller there. The Synology takes advantage of ventilation just a little bit more there with those logo vented panels there on the side. You've got the vents built into the bottom there. You have got the trays there, all lockable trays with ventilations through there. Again, the Synology logo. And on the base of the system, you've got those 2 M2 NVMe slots there built in for you to install those SSDs there comfortably. Now, in terms of the QNAP there has got that. We've got the ventilation there at the top. This is where those M2s are based inside there. There's a little bit of ventilation there on the side, and the base, you've got some ventilation there as well. And again, vent around each of the lockable plastic trays there. On the rear of each of these chassis, if we turn them around, you can see that the Synology takes advantage of 2 individual fans there, and the QNAP has the 1 fan. So again, in terms of noise and operation, although I'm inclined to say that because of the single fan, the QNAP will be quieter, in reality, when they're in operation, the QNAP is just the tiniest bit noisier there. And I think it's because it has a lot more metal in its construction overall, whereas the Synology there takes advantage of a lot more plastic in its chassis, which may not be for everyone's taste. Now, in terms of actual aesthetical design, which one looks nicer? That's really going to come up to you. If you were to put a gun to my head, which would be weird, I'd probably say the Synology is the nicer looking of the two. The QNAP has been utilising slightly modified versions of this chassis now for a number of years. And although for QNAP, I definitely prefer the chassis of the 464 over that of the Synology, in terms of comparing these two, I think the DS920 chassis I think has a little bit more work put into its design there, even though they too are utilising a slightly modified version of an existing chassis over the years. I just think this one has a little bit more modernist charm overall. But again, it's incredibly spurious, my opinion, and it all very much depends on your own aesthetic tastes and setup there. So from there, we can talk about ports and connections, because in terms of ports and connections, things are very different indeed, and not just because of the time difference between their release, but because of each of the respective brands. Now, first we'll start off with the Synology. Again, alongside those 2 fans we've mentioned, we've also got an additional USB port on the rear, as long as one on the front. We have an eSATA port that's used for expanding the device, adding an expansion device, the 5-bay DX517, a JBOD expansion chassis. And we have 2 1 gigabit Ethernet ports there that both can give you up to 109 megabytes per second, or you can combine them together for a little over or a little under 220 megabytes per second via link aggregation and a supported lag or port trunked switch. So again, fairly standard stuff, all box ticked. But even in 2020, a number of users were curious about why Synology was still sticking with 1 gigabit Ethernet there, because Even in 2020, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet had started to appear on things. It wasn't as low price as 1 GBE in most prices, but it was getting very, very close. And now fast forward to 2022, and routers with 2.5 gigabit Ethernet in at least one port are very common. Even ISP free routers from like Virgin and the like are including 2.5 GBE, and 2.5 GBE switches are now starting to arrive at the same price as 1 GBE, around a 20% to 25% more expensive depending on their architecture and design increased, of course, as well as more and more devices starting to arrive with 2.5 GBE. Alongside that, adapters for as little as $20 to $30 from StarTech, D-Link and more are starting to arrive with USB to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connectivity there to add it to a PC, Mac or Linux system very, very easily, as well as added them to NASs too. There's even 5 gigabit to USB adapters knocking around for about £45 now that allow you to utilize a USB port on your host system, your PC, Mac, Linux, whatever, and add a 500 megabytes per second external connection that you can connect with on a network there. So again, it's still very surprising that Synology have been very restrained about 2.5 GBE, because although it's by no means as ubiquitous as 1 GBE, it is worth highlighting that now 2.5 gigabit Ethernet is arriving at the same cost as 1 GBE on a lot of other devices. It seems almost churlish to not have it there in terms of future-proofing and increased bandwidth 3 to 5 years from now. That word, future-proofing. Now, on the QNAP, we can look at its ports and connections. Now, again, more than 2 years of difference, we have to factor that in, but also QNAP's own choices with most of their architecture. In terms of USB, the device has got 2 USB Gen 3 x 2 ports. So whereas this one has a couple of 500 megabyte USB ports, this has 2 1000 megabyte USB ports there. Those USBs can also be used for more appliances in terms of hardware, scanners, printers. Both of them support UPSs, but you can use those network adapters on this device along with a bunch of other expansion devices. The Synology supports a single 5-bay expansion device. This supports either 2 of the 2-bay expansions, 2 of the 4-bay expansions, 1 of the 8-bay expansions, or 1 of the 12-bay expansion devices that can be added to this thanks to those 1000 megs USB ports there. The system already has 2 USB 2 ports that normally I would really rag on and complain about, but that's because they are to be used with the HDMI out for a KVM keyboard video mouse setup that can be used in a completely parallel instance thanks to HD Station, a completely separate parallel access point that runs at the same time as the NAS's own internal QTS system that can be used for surveillance, for multimedia, it can be used for virtual machines, it can be used for a bunch of other apps and tools, along with third-party tools and homebrew tools over on QNAP Club. There are 2 of them, they output at 4K, but it is worth highlighting that second port there, it's just going to have to mirror or expand on the other port there for an extended desktop. It does not run a parallel instance of HD Station, which is a crying shame. Even if it would be a little bit more demanding, it might be useful for some that want to have more than one instance of an HDMI based application. In terms of network connectivity, as mentioned, 2.5 GBE is being adapted a great deal more in 2022, with this system arriving with 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. So again, each one can give you up to around 270 megabytes per second, and with link aggregation and a supported switch that has 2.5 GBE support and lag or port trunking, around 550 give or take megabytes per second external bandwidth on this. And remember, you can add 2.5 GBE and 5 GBE network ports with those adapters. So in terms of network connectivity and just general connectivity, the TS-453E wins by an absolute landslide. Even if you were to discount the 2 years of difference between them, which you really shouldn't, even if they were released side by side, much like the TS-453D was with this one, the network connectivity and general connectivity of the QNAP is still going to be better overall. And finally, we can talk about the software that both of these arrive with, QTS and DSM. And it has to be said that between the 2 of them, on point, if you were to put, again, all of the to and fro between the 2 of them, DSM has the smallest edge overall. Even if you know, for all of the good and the bad of both of their software, because let's be straight up about this, neither one of these has got perfect software. It should be added that overall, once we compared all the different applications back and forth, which we've done in standalone videos, by the way, I recommend you check out, it should be said that even in the tennis rally match of which one has better in different areas, overall the Synology wins there. Even if you overlook and ignore the ransomware deadbolt attack that happened to QNAP. Now, again, the provisional attack that happened more than a year ago that has continued to arrive in the news as people have not updated their firmware, and therefore that old firmware that had the deadbolt vulnerability is still out there in the wild by people that aren't updating. Even if you ignore that, overall, in terms of overall presentation, DSM still has the edge. But let's talk about particular standout applications from them. So when it comes to multimedia, there are mixed results, but overall in multimedia, I think the QNAP has the edge there. And a lot of that is to do with two things. One, QMAGI and multimedia console. Synology has the Synology Photos application, an AI supported application that has AI photo human recognition built into it, and a bunch of other features and services that are very professional grade and combine a lot of home and business photo services into one. However, the QNAP has a much better indexing and transcoding tool in Multimedia Console. And although they also have two photo applications in the professional photo station and more consumer-led QMAGI application, that QMAGI application has both AI, human photo recognition, but also thing recognition, something sadly that was available on Synology Moments that is not available currently on Synology Photos. And overall, those two tools in Multimedia Console and QMAGI, as well as that support of the AI M2 upgrade option mentioned earlier on via M2, mean that in terms of multimedia, I'm giving the QNAP there the edge, but not the complete edge you'll hear later on. In terms of surveillance, I would give the Synology the edge. Both of them run a premium surveillance application in QVR Pro and Synology Surveillance Station. And QVR Pro has 8 camera licenses and has that HDMI output with keyboard, video and mouse, as well as remote access and client tools, and that full premium application available with a control deck and everything, and AI services too. However, Surveillance Station 9 is just the slicker app overall. Even though it has only 2 camera licenses, it just feels more responsive. You have access to live camera feed and control within a web browser, something that you have to use for localized client tools to do on the QNAP. And overall, Surveillance Station just feels more fully featured overall than on the Synology than the QNAP. Bringing it back in terms of integrating with third-party clouds, the QNAP has the advantage in terms of having a lot more tools available to work over that hybrid cloud and hybrid gateway applications in hybrid mount, supporting a myriad of different third-party clouds, virtual JBOD there, hyper backup and other tools, and just a wider support with different cloud services. The Synology has most of these in one shape or form, but unlike hybrid mount, hybrid share on this, can only work with their own cloud platform, C2. Synology has a history of obviously prioritizing a lot more third-party stuff to create first-party stuff to create a perfect one-brand ecosystem to their credit. But at the same time, those cloud services and even SaaS services aren't quite as good on the Synology as they are on the QNAP, thanks to that flexibility and their wider support of third party. Now, bring it back to going back to multimedia, in terms of video station, the Synology wins, although both of them run a multimedia tool dedicated precisely to video, and both of them comparable to the likes of Plex and Envy that scrape metadata and create a near Netflix level user interface there for you to interact with. It has to be said that the DS920 does an overall better job. The user interface is better. The metadata scraping, although requires access to Google's own APIs, completely free registration tool there, the interface is so much more like Plex. It's more user friendly, and therefore you have the look and feel of Plex while also having access to native transcoding and native access without the subscription costs of Plex that require you to do that. Most of this stuff is available on Video Station for the QNAP, but it doesn't look as slick, with the added benefit that on the Synology, there are apps on Amazon Fire Stick and on other services, so you can watch your Synology multimedia with the slick kind of thumbnails, actors, reviews, description, interface that you would have with Plex on your Amazon Fire Stick, because DS Video is on Amazon Fire Stick. Whereas in the case of the QNAP, you'd have to use third-party tools to access that server there on there. Again, moving forward, we can talk about virtualization. In terms of virtual machines, the QNAP wins for me, not only because Virtualization Station has far more configuration options and two-click installations for virtual machines from the likes of Windows to Ubuntu and more, and open pfSense and other VM platforms. 2 clicks, download, deploy. But on top of that, it also has Ubuntu Station, where you can download and deploy a standalone Linux VM easily. Again, 2 to 3 clicks max, and HDMI output. But on top of that, Container Station, their own first-party container app that's a lot more flexible in most cases than the Synology offering, which takes advantage of Docker. And although it does have Synology's Virtual Machine Manager, which is a great VM tool, again, it's nowhere near as flexible and as third-party supporting of that as that of Virtualization Station. In terms of backup tools, I would say there's large parity. They both got their own hyper backup versus hybrid backup sync 3, along with USB backup tools and virtual machine backup tools. I give the edge slightly in terms of enterprise level backups, thanks to their support of Active Backup Suite. But I would say with the QNAP, hybrid backup sync 3 for more individual and small business backups is better. It's just once you integrate those enterprise backups and you start looking at support of Google Workspace and Office 365, that's when you have to use BoxSafe from QNAP, which is a license requiring app. Whereas on the Synology, Active Backup Suite 3 at the time of recording, at least, there's those words again, is free and allows you to synchronize with those cloud platforms at no additional cost. In terms of file management, I'd give it to the Synology because of Synology Drive. They both let you access your files remotely, but Synology Drive is just, in terms of its interface on the browser, as well as the integrated tools that allow file pinning and file streaming locally. And it's just much easier to create a shared team folder locally on PC and Mac systems, with a lot more of the advantages thrown in. And just its integration with the Synology platform, and particularly Microsoft Windows, but hopefully soon Mac to a larger degree, just put Synology Drive there just a little bit more in the front. And with Plex Media Server, if you're a Plex buyer, the QNAP is probably going to perform the better over the tool, simply thanks to the enhanced hardware inside. But overall, in terms of software, you just find that the Synology platform feels a little bit more polished and it's a lot smoother. They put a lot more work into its aesthetics overall. Whereas the QNAP one there always feels like you do a little bit more configuring. Feels a little bit more like Android and Windows. Whereas DSM is trying to emulate the Mac OS and the slick, user-friendly nature. Not a configurable. And certainly it takes longer for tools to arrive on the Synology platform because of that larger scale of testing. But overall, between the two of them, the software on the Synology is just that little bit better. And overall, hopefully this video has helped you decide which one is better suited to your needs, be they hardware, longevity, be they software, be they what you're getting for your money in terms of value, or just the overall cost. Do let me know which one of these two was the one that stood out for you throughout this comparison. It would be great to know which one of these you opted for in the end. Thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video. It really helps me understand what I'm doing right and doing wrong. Click subscribe as we compare more and more NASs and look at the whole gamut of data storage. We do a video every day and an article every other day. And if you're interested in buying either of these and you were going to go to Amazon anyway, use the links in the description. It takes you there, it takes you to your own store, it doesn't cost you anything extra, and we get a kickback which helps us continue making lots more videos. Otherwise, take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares in the free advice link below, or head over to the blog on Ask NAS Compares, where the community are there to help you answer whatever questions you have about data storage and setting one of these up in your own home or business. Other than that, I will see you next time.